Please introduce yourself.
Well, hi, I'm Bill Tilton. I'm a lifelong resident of St. Paul, and I'm happy to be here to share whatever I can.
And I'm Rob Hahn. We're in St. Paul today. The date is December 14th, and we are talking about Dinkytown.
2018.
Thank you. Yes. Let's start generically. Give me your memories of your first impressions of Dinkytown.
Well, my first impressions of Dinkytown were almost primordial because my father had gone to the university and he talked about hanging out in Dinkytown, and that would have been in the 1920s. For myself, I started school in 1965, and a fraternity brother's family owned a restaurant in the Dinkytown Dome building there on, 14th and University. And so I was having meals there in 1965. This is long before Dinkytown became synonymous with the era of the vital countercultural era. But as a countercultural location and phenomenon in shorthand, Dinkytown then in 67, 68, 69, I remember going to the Scholar Coffee House. We did not realize at the time that it would become such a legendary place because it housed, Bob Dylan once or three times or whatever. Was Vecchio's Pizza there at the time, or some predecessor to it? So I remember eating pizza there and going to Gray's Drugstore. And
Was pizza? We interviewed Shel Danielson, otherwise known as Alan Stone.
I love him.
And we'll talk more about him and what he had to say regarding your days at KQ toward the end of the interview. But he said, coming from Edina, pizza was still kind of a new thing. Did you find it to be a new thing, or was it just something cool and fashionable?
Well, relatively new. I mean, we didn't cook pizza at home. Carboni's Pizza in St. Paul was a regular high school hangout for St. Paulites from Cretin in that era, and so it was not a new thing in that regard.
Dinkytown, what is it, do you think, that made it such a center of an intellectual center, a center of activism, a countercultural center?
Well, inherently because it's a community of bohemian sorts on the edge of a major university. I mean, my old friend Marv Davidoff, a sainted man who has now died, who was a freedom rider in 1961, founder of the Honeywell Project, etc. He started out in the late 50s as a life model. He was a nude model working in Dinkytown. I mean, it's always been a bohemian era. Bob Dylan played in the Scholar Coffee House. What years would that have been? 66, 67?
A little earlier than that.
Even 60, earlier.
61 and 62, I think, before he went to New York.
Oh, that's a surprise. Okay, all right. I didn't realize it was that early. I like to believe I was there in later years, but I certainly wasn't there then.
Let's throw out some other names. We talked about Marv. Diane Wiley. You had
love Diane Wiley
with her. What are your memories and the stories?
Well, I first met her after she had just come back from 6 months in Greece, and she was tan and in great shape and always full of life. She's one of the most brilliant people that I know. She's a very verbal, talkative, outgoing, stimulating, and fun person. So I'm proud to say that I have been her friend for a long time. But we'd actually gotten to know each other just as sort of co-activists. In 1970 is really my first memory of Diane. I was very involved on campus in anti-war and student power sorts of stuff, and she was, of course, sympathetic and part of that movement, but got very involved in the Red Barn stuff in Dinkytown. I'm sure you're covering that by people who are much more involved than me. It was very funny because we all supported each other. Of course, the community effort around the Red Barn was totally the same crowd of people and the same mindset of people that was involved in the anti-war movement and things. But once or twice there was a little bit of competition for who's going to have their demonstration on such and such a time, right? And there were a couple of times there were sort of competing events. and there were occasionally discussions, if not arguments, about, well, what are you doing? You can't do that. We got this going on. But in general, so I'm free associating with Diane Wiley. She was always just a stalwart activist, a happy person, a dedicated person, a wonderful person. She's still at it. She got involved in jury work during the Wounded Knee leadership trials when those got moved up here in '73 and '74. I can take a little credit for getting her into jury work, and she's still doing it now, all these decades later. She's still a core person for something called the National Jury Project. And whenever there is a major political trial or trials, for example, the Sacred Stone Camp of Seti-Sakowin Native activists that opposed the DAPL pipeline, Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota, the Jury Project was there doing survey work, talking about who can get a fair trial where and things like that. And I won't go to a major jury trial without her at my elbow, helping me pick a jury.
Tell me about your memories and interactions with Father Harry Burry of the Newman Center at the time.
Harry Burry, I got to know not in an activist way. I came out of the Irish Catholic ghetto of St. Paul, and so University of Minnesota is a commuter campus, so all of us Cretan kids were sort of Cretan and Our Lady of Peace and Durham kids were commuting together to campus. What was the meeting place for Catholics from St. Paul but the Newman Center, which is actually right across 17th Street from my fraternity at University Avenue. And so Harry Burry ran the Newman Center. He was just sort of a university community center guy. Before he was a political activist, he was a campus organizer and counselor and confessor and things. And so we knew Harry Burry just as the stalwart guy who ran the Catholic Center. And it was just, it was a coincidence I'm proud of the fact that I can claim to have known him before he was an activist or on non-activist terms, just because we were Catholic kids hanging out in the basement of the Newman Center between classes.
He said he became an activist and really aware of the Vietnam War when a lot of Catholics would come to him and want a letter of conscientious objection. Did you know people like that, students who were seeking CO status?
Well, of course. And so I did not know that. And so, the Vietnam War radicalized so many people, and Harry became quite the leader, and a very respected fella. And so I'm not surprised that that's what brought him into the fold of anti-war activists.
He told us a story, and I'm wondering if you were part of this demonstration at all. It was a protest after the Kent State killings, and there were students protesting outside the ROTC building. You had police on one side, students on the other, and Father Burry and others walked right between them and kind of kept the peace over a number of hours, maybe even over a couple of days. Were you involved in that at all?
Oh, I certainly would have been there. Yeah, and in fact, I might have photographs of it in one of my drawers here, or in a box in my basement. I have a dozen boxes left over from that era of materials in my basement, including photographs from those demonstrations. Anyway, there were times when it was very helpful to have people like Harry Burry and Burnham Terrell, and I can just think of any number of older, sort of more level-headed activists at the time, because there were students who were young and dumb and vigorous and crazier than they maybe should have been, and University Police Department that I had a lot of respect for, that didn't want to have confrontations with people. And we had a Minneapolis police force that wanted an excuse to come on campus and thump heads, which they ultimately did in 1972. Do I specifically remember Harry Burry doing that? No, but I remember that occurring and being very grateful for sensible people who acted as
the spirit of activism, whether it was civil rights or Vietnam War protest, were those topics that were discussed almost on a daily basis when you would get together at a place like the Scholar or the V?
so the question is whether these issues were discussed on a daily basis. First of all, I have to admit, I can't say I went to the Scholar very often. And when I was at the varsity, the V, they were never discussed. That was the early years of being in a fraternity and on campus, and politics wasn't part of the discussion. Politics became our life after 1968, certainly. But that doesn't mean that we always talk politics, even among activists. Sometimes we just got together and listened to the Firesign Theater and smoked dope. Okay, you asked the wrong question by focusing it on the Scholar or on the V. When people got together, if it was folk that were organizing, then that's why we were together, and that is what we talked about. But if you got together with your high school friends, it was sometimes just sort of understood you're against the war and going to the demonstration, and you talk about other things. It was part of our soul that we believed in these things, that we were going to be active about it. And so there were times when that's all we talked about, and I chaired many a meeting doing that. I became the co-chairman of the mobilization committee End the War in Vietnam and spent hours chairing meetings. But socializing, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes we just wanted to go hear rock and roll music and talk about who we were going to see this weekend.
You mentioned when we talked on the phone that you obviously were a McCarthy supporter for
of course,
President
yes.
in '68. Was there any conflict among your friends with having two Minnesotans in the race, Humphrey versus McCarthy, or was it pretty much all McCarthy?
Interesting question. Humphrey folk versus McCarthy folk. I have to say, I really didn't know Humphrey folk. In my social group, those who paid attention to politics were peaceniks, were anti-war folk, and were McCarthy supporters. Certainly, I knew people that weren't McCarthy supporters. I was in a fraternity that had a whole lot of conservative folk who went into the Army and became very strong supporters of the Vietnam War. But that was a different discussion. And so it wasn't a matter of Humphrey versus McCarthy. That's a question for people who were much more involved in the DFL than I was. We sort of scorned electoral politics at the time, especially after the '68 convention, when the McCarthy delegation was so roundly rejected and thumped upon by Daley's cops in Chicago. So I started out activism, at least anti-war activism, by sitting at McCarthy tables, and so believing in electoral politics. But it quickly segued into different sorts of efforts on my personal part.
Tell me about the inception, if you will, of the Minnesota 8.
Well, the Minnesota 8, as you know, was a group of 8 people arrested in 3 different draft boards around the state of Minnesota as we were caught inside by the FBI, intending to remove and destroy selective service records. We were going to feed the records of draft age men to the Mississippi River. The FBI was waiting for us, so we were better burglars than we were on security. And the genesis of it came out of a groundswell of things beyond me. It just started happening that, the highest visibility folk were in the Midwest were certainly the Berrigan brothers. And in Milwaukee, they'd removed destroyed records in public by pouring homemade napalm on them and waited around to be arrested. And I was at that time giving speeches on a regular basis, almost a daily basis, sometimes multiple times a day. Because I ended up in a leadership role in the state anti-war committee, I'd go to high schools and speak to half a dozen social studies classes. I'd go to churches to speak to their community involvement group at night. And I'd get asked questions like, do you support flag burning? And I said, I don't support flag burning. I would explain why I thought somebody might do it and why it ought to be legal, but I didn't support it. But they'd ask, do you support draft board raids? And I had to think about it, and I decided I do support it, that the war is bad enough, that we need to throw some gravel in the war machine. And the typical political efforts at turning the ship of state weren't working, and so citizens had to take things into their own hands. Well, in that time of our lives, I can't just verbally support it. You are what you do, right? And so once I was confronted with the question, do you support it, and had to say that I did support it after thinking about it, and then I decided, well, I got to do it. And I was connected enough within the community, locally and nationally, that I sort of knew who was doing it. And so I just said, the next time it happens, I want in. I mean, in other regards, 99% of my life was above ground organizing, and I was a convener and a speaker and ran meetings and microphones and stuff. I was simply a soldier for the draft board raids. I just said, you are what you do. I support this, therefore I must do it. So I got into a network of folk that I took leadership from. I even went to Detroit once for a draft board raid that didn't occur. That's an interesting sidebar story. That's geographically nowhere near close to Dinkytown.
This is a bit of a stretch, but I at least want to have your thoughts on it. When we were talking to Shel Danielson, he said that you and Clyde Bellacourt and maybe others each had your own show from time to time on KQ. How'd that come about, and what was the topic? What was it like doing your own show on KQ?
I got on KQ through hubris or stupidity, or a combination of the two. I'd just gotten out of prison and I loved KQRS, and they had no news. And so I went to the station, knocked on their door, and said, you need a news department, and you should hire me to do it. Well, Dick Poe was the station manager, very good guy, not at all political, very nice guy. Just sort of politely laughed. He gave me a half hour. We sat and chatted. We had a good time. We liked each other right from the beginning. But he politely showed me the door. Well, at that time, radio stations had a public affairs broadcasting requirement. They had to promise the FCC they would do a certain number of hours per year on topics important to the community, and they'd give a list of 10. And they're the kinds of topics that you normally do shows on anyway: elections and health and whatever. And so I think they'd had somebody else plan to do this program who dropped out of the running, and all of a sudden I got a cold call saying, Bill, you want to host a radio call-in talk show? And so this would have been 1974. All of a sudden I had a weekly call-in talk show on KQRS on Sunday nights, KQ Scope. This is KQ Scope. And I did it for a couple of years. Simultaneously, I was working at Minnesota Public Radio as an engineer. I had no social life. Every Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday afternoon, I was at public radio, and then I'd drive out to Golden Valley to KQRS. And I quit them both in 1976 to go study a term of law school at the University of Ghana in West Africa. And just fortuitously, when I came back, I ended up working back at both places. KQ had hired 2 women to replace me, and Dick just put me into the rotation. I did every third Sunday instead of every Sunday, and Minnesota Public Radio hired me to do a legal documentary. So I was with both stations then until the 80s, till the early 80s.
When you look back on your time in and around Dinkytown, what impact did that have on your life?
Oh, it totally defined my life. It totally set the tone for, you were confronted with the need to react to important historical current events, and I think forced people to decide, I want to act in a moral way, I want to act in a progressive way, I want to act in a community-oriented way. But for those movements, but for the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, and we had the first Earth Day, of course, in 1970, I might have just become another corporate lawyer. You know, I went to college on a Great Northern Railway scholarship, and I promised I would seek employment there. And so I was headed towards corporate law. But for that era, but for those movements, that's what I would have been. Or I could have been a politician. I could have been running for election. I've told more than one politician, there but for a felony conviction, go I.
So tell us about Purple Haze and your role in it.
Purple Haze is a wonderful movie made by old friends David Burton Morris and Vicky Wozniak Morris, and it follows somebody not unlike me insofar as, you know, middle class kid from a family in a middle-sized town, St. Paul, who went to a military high school and who was confronted by questions about the war and the counterculture and drugs and music and sex and rock and roll and all that. I had recently gotten out of prison when they were making the movie, and they asked me to sort of be typecast, to play somebody giving an anti-war speech. And so I had fun with it. It was great. I just said, you know, tell me what year and month your setting is, and I went and researched the facts of the war at that time, and just assembled the facts that I would have used in the speech I would have made at that time about the war. And it was sort of funny because David and Vicki let me write my own copy, such as it was. And so I'm giving my speech, and David stopped, of course, because they had to do something, shuffle around, move the camera. I can't remember what it was. And he said, well, pick it up from whatever line I'd used when he interrupted me. And I had to tell him, I said, David, I don't have any copy written. I'm just making this up as I go along. He laughed and shrugged, and so I just kept making it up as I went along. So I whatever made it into the movie was just me ad-libbing with a few notes about what the circumstances were of the war at the time. But it's a great movie. It's an important movie, and very well done.
I would ask you a question about music of that era and what role it played in your life, particularly around Dinkytown performances, Colonel Ray Glover.
Well, I'm proud to call Dave Ray a dear friend, and I would regularly. Dave Ray was a good friend, and Tommy Ray's brother and Max Ray they provided some magic music. The Paisleys was a great group at the time. I don't know if you ever heard of the Paisleys. They were. I attended bar at a hot young singles bar at the time in 1969. The Red Baron, it was called, and the Paisleys would play there. They were the classic stoner, sort of Stones band. It's a Grateful Dead type band at the time. And music was a very important part of things. I'm privileged that I went to Woodstock. I was at Woodstock. I have two programs from Woodstock. And great memories. Music was important, a part of our consciousness, of our revolution, and it continues. This morning, I made reservations to take my daughter to Neil Young, who's coming here next month. But I can just, as you ask that question, I can hear Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young, and Four Dead in Ohio, and things like that, and Jefferson Airplane, Up Against the Wall, Mother, whatever, and those were part of our soul. It wasn't all political. We'd sometimes just drop LSD and go up and down the Jefferson Airplane. We'd stack up all of the Jefferson Airplane records and then all of our Stones records, our Beatles records, and just listen. And Firesign Theater also was something that's part of that era that's been forgotten. But music and grooming were an important part of that era. So we were lucky to be alive at that time. It was such a vital time. I mean, there were bad things going on. The war was bad. Racial discrimination was bad, and these were fights that were necessary. But it was still a time of cultural renaissance, of a musical renaissance, of, I think, philosophical discussions that occurred just on a common basis that didn't then occur. There was sort of a void for a decade or three where people weren't dealing with important issues on a day-to-day basis.